Well, listen, it's a real pleasure to be here. We'll do a sitting for about a half hour, and then afterwards, we're going to have a talk and a discussion, and it's around the topic of memory, remembering, and suffering. And I find this a really fascinating and really helpful topic because it's just something we're doing all the time. And unless we're paying attention to it, it can be a major source of suffering. And learning how to deal with memories, particularly difficult memories and problematic thinking associated with memories, can be a wonderful part of practice and really help us to not just reduce the suffering, but point our minds in the right direction. So we'll sit here a little bit. I'll do just a little bit of guiding, not too much, and then we'll go from there. Okay. So those of you who are familiar with me, who sat with me before, know that I consider the preliminary aspect of beginning the sitting as important as any other part of the sitting. And the reason is that what we do in the first 5-10 minutes of the sitting conditions, it acts as the foundation for all the experience that follows. So in Buddhist practice, everything is about causes and conditions and trying to set up the conditions, circumstances, both in our body and in our mind that allow the body and the mind to relax, but be awake and open and receptive so that we can actually explore the experience that's unfolding during the meditation. So maybe take a few minutes to do what works for you to arrive in the present moment. And really make the effort to notice if you're bringing something into the meditation. Energy that's being carried forward from events prior to beginning, a mood, state of mind, thinking. All of those will influence what happens next. And see if we can just note those things. It's important to acknowledge them. You know, we're not trying to avoid or deny or suppress anything the mind considers to be an interference, but we do want to acknowledge it, feel it, experience it, so we can see that it has an energy to it that could influence our meditation. And then see if we can just begin to release, let go of whatever is present, including blocks or stiffness in the body, and just allow the flow of energy in the mind and the body to open up freely and find its own rhythm. And during this initial period, I know depending on the tradition we're in, there's all kinds of unstated assumptions about moving and the way we're holding our body. Don't hesitate at all during this first preliminary part of the sitting to move your body in the sense of finding the position that allows the body and the mind to feel stable and at ease and supports the conditions for a calm and open mind. And don't forget to enjoy the process. I find setting up the body, um, feeling it release, feeling a sense of letting go on the out breath to really be enjoyable. It's a pleasant, helpful, useful quality of body and mind. And then whenever you get settled, whether you use the breath or the body as a whole or the balance of your spine and your hips as an anchor, I think it's really helpful to have an anchor that stabilizes your attention that you can return to during the meditation. Particularly at this hour of the day after a long day, it's really easy for the mind to uh, space out, just kind of get lost in uh, comfortable states, um, dive into thinking. And the role of an anchor, being able to come back to it for a little bit and to move from concept or agitation or arousal to the calmness of the breath or the body or the spine, restabilizes awareness. And then we can open back up into the experiences that are unfolding. So, as a reminder, while we're in the middle of the meditation, it's helpful to periodically check in and do the same thing that we did when we start the meditation, and actually look at what's present and what's happening. What's the level of our energy? What states of mind are present? Are we actually in present moment experience, or are we in thought instead? Or have we lost focus and the mind is unfocused or a little dull or a little sleepy? So the reason we do that is the purpose behind our sitting and in our work is actually to understand our experience and to have insight. And unless we are trying to maintain the conditions that support us being awake and open and calm, it's difficult to have moment to moment awareness and to explore our experience. So these check ins can be very helpful. And then they tell us what we might need to do. We need to bring our energy up, where if we're really caught in thought, we need to uh, really honor that and use some of the steps we can take to minimize or move thought into the background. Um, and maybe we just need to reconnect with our intention to be awake and interested and curious. The circumstances will tell us what we need to do. So in the last few minutes, excuse me, of the meditation, uh, just allow your awareness to begin moving back out into the body as a whole, from the inside out to the extremities, and uh, take the opportunity to notice the quality and level, the depth of the awareness that is present, how it's changed since we first began the sitting. And then use coming back out into our normal level of awakening in reality as an opportunity to just see the beauty um, and the pleasure of being a human, of the beauty of being able to hear the sounds in the room, and the beauty of feeling your hands touching each other, or the cloth, your pants, or the skin of your legs, uh, the weight of your body in the chair or a cushion, the contact points and the different degrees of sensation, pressure of the contact points of your different parts of your body touching the floor, the cushion, or a bench, or a chair, or a couch. Feel the moisture in your mouth, the moisture in your eyes. All these things that are happening on their own to take care of us as a human being. And then whenever you're ready, begin to gently open your eyes and uh, readjust your eyes and appreciate and find some pleasure in the beauty of seeing, of objects, shapes, form, color. It's really an extraordinary thing to be human. So, okay. So um, we, Mountain Stream runs a tight ship on Monday nights. So we will break for just like 5 minutes, just long enough to grab some tea or coffee, use the bathroom, and then come back. And let's see if we can do that. I think you'll want to hear this talk right from the beginning. Okay, so see you in a minute. Okay, so I think I am going to go ahead and start. So welcome to this evening with Mountain Stream. I want to thank you for being here. Um, I find being together like this with a group of people who are actually interested in exploring how our minds and our bodies work, and the teachings of the historical Buddha, just to be so supportive and nourishing. And I hope it's the same for you. So thank you for being here and being part of this. So this evening's talk is about memory, remembering, and suffering. And I really like this topic because it's a topic about where we live all the time. Memory plays such a significant role in conditioning, shaping, forming, coloring our daily thought, and particularly our identity, and how we move from the place of our identity. So this talk is about memory, uh, the good parts, the bad parts, how it's formed, particularly the difficult aspects of it, and the Buddha's recommendations for different ways to deal with this. So I'd like to start with a common experience, and I start with this because I think all of us can relate to this. During the last year, I personally had this happen to me, but I've had 3 different students come to me and want to talk about uh, different facts, but exactly the same situation. And the situation is that you have an encounter with someone. Um, Afterwards, you have the impression that something went wrong in the discussion. The person is mad at you. The person is upset at you. Over time, you think about it. This strengthens um, the attachment to the idea that something was wrong, and um, it starts to shape your behavior. Either maybe you avoid the person. When you think about them, you feel tense. Um, and in each case, of these 3 people, in 2 cases, it was 2 women who, with their sisters, who live in different cities, and there'd been an interchange, and then there were months in between before they communicated. So the 2 people who talked to me for months, they're ruminating about this and strengthening the sense of aversion. And in the other case, it was a student, a friend of mine, a man, and it had to do with a fellow coworker. So those meetings resulted in them approaching the other person and basically, and I'm sure this has happened to you, finding out that the impression that something had gone wrong, that the person was mad at you, that the person was upset at you, was just like completely wrong. It was the most basic form of misinformation. Um, and so the initial perception that there was a problem was stored in memory. It's a false memory. It becomes a false memory, but it keeps getting strengthened. And the fascinating part about this is during the entire time in between, these people and myself, and I'm sure you believe that it's true. And it's shaping our behavior, even though it's not true. And so this is an illustration for me of the Buddhist fundamental notion that we make the world, and also that we make this our own suffering with our thoughts and with our memory. So what I'm going to try to do in this talk is deconstruct from a Buddhist perspective and also modern memory research, how this happens, why it happens, use some illustrations, and I think we'll have plenty of time for some discussion about it. So the starting place for this, and this is an intersection of Buddhist psychology and modern memory brain research, is Buddhist psychology starts with how does consciousness appear? And consciousness appears not in the sense that we commonly think of it in the Western world as a unitary consciousness. The Buddhist idea is that there are 6 separate forms of consciousness, each associated with the 6 sense doors. So where there is contact between an object and a sense door, consciousness arises. So an illustration would be is right now, without doing like anything fancy or special, move your attention to the bottom of your right foot and feel what's there. Now, unless there's a neural problem with the foot or in the nerves coming up the leg or the spinal cord, you can like immediately feel the sensations on the bottom of your foot. So that would be sensory consciousness that arises through contact. And what's fascinating is all those sensations were there the moment before you moved your attention there, but you weren't feeling them. So attention becomes like the doorway that opens consciousness. Now, the fascinating part about this is that each of our different forms of consciousness, sensory awareness are stored at different locations in the brain. And depending on how we're paying attention, they're stored in different detail, clarity, and strength. So the pop version that I think most people have is that there is a memory bank from which we withdraw whole memories. It's completely false. There is no memory bank. There is no single intact memory stored in the brain. It is a composite that the brain pulls together of the consciousness of these 6 areas into a patchwork. And it's also not like a photograph or a video. It's more like an impression, a tapestry, an interpretation. And this is also what modern brain and memory research says. So how does this happen? So we want to have a memory, or a memory appears, the brain retrieves and organizes the information from the different locations in the brain. Um, as I mentioned, they're stored in different locations, different degrees and depth of clarity. And what we'll call them back normally is the strongest impression of the sense at the moment of storage. That acts as the trigger. So, for example, you'll hear a song and immediately be transported back to a time when something happened. And usually, what will happen is not so much the facts of what were going on, but the feeling. The facts are there, but the predominant thing is the song acts as a trigger. That's the sense door. Um, and there's a feeling about it. One of the things that happens for me is if I smell marinara sauce that has a certain amount of garlic and olive oil in it, uh, I'm immediately transported back to this experience of my little old immigrant grandmother cooking for her 12 kids and their families this marinara sauce. And it's not so much all the facts, although I remember some facts. What comes back is the feeling of her love that she communicated through her cooking. So how things get stored and how they are recalled is colored, influenced, and distorted by the conditions that are present at the time that something happens and we store them in our mind. So, a couple of illustrations. Recently, a former president, there was an attempted assassination. And I happened to be watching the news reports that night, and one of the reporters was interviewing people who were there. So they interviewed this one man, and with great confidence, he reported that he was close to the stage and then begins to repeat everything he saw. He said that he knew that the shooter had been right on the edge of the stage on the left-hand side because he could see the smoke that had come from the gun. He couldn't see the gun, but he could see the smoke from the gun, and he could tell the way that the people moved their bodies, that the person was at a certain level next to the stage. A lot of details. So to make a long story short, everything he remembered was wrong. Yeah, yeah, that he saw. And the very next guest, it was fascinating, was a former military colonel. And he said, that report is a wonderful illustration of what in the military we call the fog of war. And this happens to people all the time in automobile accidents, um, emotional situations, physical situations, that our emotions overwhelm and color the accuracy of our perception and actually create a perception to fit a story that we create about what happened. And as a lawyer, I was by trade, I was a lawyer for many years, and I was always fascinated by people coming in and reporting their experience, and then it changing over a number of months or years when we worked together. And there is actually a jury instruction that is given to juries in any case where important information is based on eyewitness testimony. And the instruction is that eyewitness testimony is inherently unreliable. And then it gives like 7, 8, 10 factors to evaluate in whether you can rely on first person memory. So that I find that extraordinarily profound, because our normal habit is to remember something and just accept it as it must be true. I saw it. And as you'll see in a moment, that's not necessarily true. And in addition to everything else, we have, as Buddhists or people who are interested in Buddhist practice, we know that our regular uh, patterns of desires, aversions, attachment, identification has enormous influence over how we react to things, how we see them, and our wanting something to be a particular way, or wanting it to be true, or our fear that is true, shapes and colors it. And my opening illustration would be an illustration of that. That I have this experience, and I'm fearful that they're angry or upset with me, and then I create a whole story about it and intensify it. So what all the research shows, and if you actually look carefully, start to use this as a practice, you see that um, our mind and what we call our ego, all of those factors, edits and revises what our mind has stored, our memory, to support a narrative that has a particular meaning. And it's always incomplete, as in the opening illustration. And so what the mind does, what the ego does, is fill in the answers so you have a picture that has meaning. And so it adds assumptions, projections, judgments, it assigns blame, it assigns fault, maybe it includes shame and guilt. In the opening illustration, the assumption is that I must have done something wrong to prompt that response. And I'm projecting that it happened because of a particular thing that I did. And then I'm making a judgment about the other person or myself, all being made up. And so, as a general rule, lots of our memory is partial, selective, highly subjective, factually inaccurate. And that is why in traditional Buddhism, memory is referred to as delusion and fabrication, and we're cautioned about the accuracy of it, because memory is more about feelings and impressions, meaning and interpretation. And so, one way I'm finding helpful just to characterize this for myself is that memory tends to be a reliable source of misinformation and disinformation because of all of this editing that goes on. And I've been testing myself on that. So, what is the Buddhist perspective on this? And then what are the recommendations of how we deal with it? From a Buddhist perspective, memory is part of a structure of dependent origination of the conditions that lead to attachment, identification, and suffering, that is called formations or mental formations. And what a mental formation or formation is, a sankhara, is basically a little bundle that has a thought, a feeling, an emotion, and then a reactive pattern to those that is stored in the body and the mind. And that can be either negative or positive. It can be helpful or unhelpful. Tonight, we're talking primarily about those that are unhelpful. The significance of these is that they are embedded in the mind and in the body through memory, and they're just waiting to be triggered. So when we hear a song, when someone says to us that triggers us, we see through that mental formation, that little bundle of thoughts, feelings, emotions, and reactive patterns. And this explains why we have an immediate reaction of a feeling tone of every experience that we have, a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And what happens is through repetition, and if you think about this, this makes so much sense just practically through repetition of those getting triggered over and over and over and over again. Those reactive patterns become fixed views and beliefs. And as a general rule, they're unchallenged and unquestioned. As a general rule, when we become, when our memory and the pattern associated with it, when we become attached and identified with it as a result of repetition, we tend to accept and treat it as objectively true. And more importantly, and this is the important part, as part of our personal narrative and our personal history. And the interesting part about this, and actually from a standpoint of suffering, kind of the disturbing and maybe frightening part, is that we do this despite intellectually knowing that our memories are partial, selective, subjective, and factually inaccurate. And so autobiographical memory is not who or what we are, it's what we have attached and identified with over a period of time. And this is the reason that you will find no discourse of the historical Buddha, no sutta, no talk, that encourages us to dive in and evaluate the content of autobiographical memory. We tend to think from a Western perspective that our suffering is because something happened to us, or that we have an accurate memory of what happened to us. And that's just simply not true. The reason that we suffer from a Buddhist perspective is that we have a relationship with the memory that is in our mind. Whether it's accurate or inaccurate, the problem is that the relationship, if it's negative, is reactive, that when it's triggered, there's a causation, and that causation causes us to suffer. So from a practice perspective in Buddhism, it's a very clear issue what we do with our attention. Do we move our attention into the narrative and content of memory, or do we focus our attention on the causation, the reactive pattern, how it comes up, and then how it causes us to be reactive? And the answer to that question is the second of the two. Everything is causes and conditions, and looking at the causation. And if we can do that, it's why practice depersonalizes. It takes all the heat off of memories once we learn how to do it. So I'm going to talk just briefly about traditional ways of how to work with this. And I want to say as a starting place that I have personally found that many of these will sound very familiar, but in this context, they may sound more helpful. Each of these requires, for them to work, actually they demand that you develop a habit, a healthy habit of working with memory and problematic thinking associated with memory in this way. But if you do, it is so helpful in diminishing suffering once it comes up, avoiding suffering, and then helping us understand and depersonalizing it so that it begins to weaken and disappear. So U Tejaniya, the Burmese monk, who I think is such a wonderful teacher, he says that there's two main causes that shape our present experience. One is the momentum of good and bad habits, which includes all these mental formations, right? So you can hear that immediately. They're just waiting to be activated. Once they get activated, we're reactive. You think about it, you can see that in your own life in all different areas. And the second is what we do right now with that. So in terms of memory, It's in the moment, in the present moment experience, recognizing that mental formations have arisen and making wise choices about them. So, in terms of working with this, I think the starting place is to commit yourself to a frame of context of how you're going to hold your experience of memory and thoughts arising from memory. And that frame is what the Buddha said, is that we make the world and our suffering with our thoughts and our memories. And that a thought is just a thought until we add attachment, identification, and a story. So the problem is not the memory, which is a thought, but the trigger that causes the reactivity to take place. So the Buddha's recommendation is that when we see that memories come up and it starts to push our mind and our heart in the wrong direction, that we be cautious, that we don't automatically accept it, that we question it and investigate it, and realize that maybe we don't know whether it's true or not, or how true it is. So for me, that's the frame. The second part is setting an intention. And of course, this is the hard part, but the intention is in terms of working with keeping our attention in present moment experience and out of the content, thought, and story of the memory. That we stay in the present moment and out of the thought, the story, or the content. So to be clear about this, we're not trying to avoid or escape or suppress memory or problematic thoughts. That's not it at all. That's just not helpful. That would become a new negative mental formation. What we're trying to do is, through working with this in a healthy way, establish a new habit that helps us see and understand how it works and not suffer. So we actually want to acknowledge and experience the reactive pattern. You know, when that trigger goes off, you can feel it in your body. If it's attachment, it causes agitation. If it's identification, it causes an urge to manage and control, and protect and be defensive. So you can feel those things quite clearly. So using those as a wake-up call. But having this intention to stay in the present moment as an anchor. So in the same way in meditation, if you're using the breath or the body or spine as your anchor that you return to stabilize, that here you're using the commitment to stay in present moment experience. So you see the reactivity come up, it immediately takes you up into your mind and personalization. You come back to present moment experience. And so kind of an illustration I like of this is, let's say you're in a restaurant and you're having a good discussion with a friend. You're the two of you are right here, and on the other side of the room, a waiter drops a plate. So you don't try to like act like it didn't happen or ignore it or not hear it. I mean, you just turn, you look, you see what happened. Did anybody get hurt? What's going on? And then what do? To bring the attention back into the present moment experience. Boom, you're right back on the discussion. So you don't allow the trigger, the reactivity, to pull you into the thought or content or the story of whatever the event is that's going to take you down the negative rabbit hole. So there's traditionally, well, there's a lot, but I think there's two very clear and quite helpful methods to try to do this. And the first one is basically, when this reactivity comes up, not buying into it, not holding on to it, and instead letting go. And there's two ways that this is described. One is a very direct way, is that you actually acknowledge, you experience the arising of the reactivity, you see the urge of the mind to want to dive into the narrative, into the story. And you just treat that as a thought and allow it to move through the mind. So the mind is reaching out to grab it and it's restrained. You just let it go. And the analogy usually is it's like leaves floating in a stream or a river that just go by. And the other method is kind of a foreground background, where if the first one, if the energy is too strong, that you intentionally shift the focus. You know that the focus on the content, the story, the narrative is going to take you in the wrong direction. You refocus the attention intentionally into present moment experience. And so, just a personal experience on this. I last week I went down to the Monterey Peninsula and Carmel and Big Sur, which an area for all of my adult life has been an important place. When I'm down there, there's places I go that I just, I feel good. And all of the major events, both good and bad, in my adult life, losses, divorces, dealing with difficult situations, in one way or another, all involve different locations in that area. So when I went down, I was in a very relaxed, open, expansive place. And I arrived down there, had lunch with some friends, and then was kind of exploring on my own. And I hadn't been down for maybe 4 or 5 years before COVID. So maybe 10 years. And what happened was, because my mind was so open and receptive, I was just flooded with memories. I mean, everything I looked at, I've never had quite this experience, but it's like everything I looked at um, brought a flood of memories. And as I was talking about, the bundle of thought, feeling, emotion, and a reactive pattern with it. So certain restaurants, certain locations, certain tree groves down by Big Sur, certain parts of the beach at Carmel. And so this is really fascinating to me, and I really wanted to enjoy it and work with it and see what I could learn with it, because a lot of the memories that were coming up uh, were negative, and some of them were quite powerful. So I just worked with these two methods. So the first one was, there were so many of them coming up, I just see it, and sometimes I would note it or just see the memory and then just let go, just open to it. You're not fighting it. It's not adversity. You're just releasing it. And when I was able to do that, it was actually quite pleasant, because I could be involved in everything I was doing, and there was just kind of this flow of sensory awareness, a thought, a sound, an image, talking to somebody, having a cup of coffee, a memory. But it was just like this stream of energy. That's the way it should work. Fortunately, most of the time it was. Sometimes it wasn't. And then this foreground background technique, when my mind really wanted to jump in and grab a hold of it, what I would do is I would shift the attention to sensory present moment experience. So, that could be a tree, it could be a crack in the cement, it could be a person having a cup of coffee and looking at their image. It could be clouds in the sky. But you shift the focus to direct experience, or you could work on something else. I mean, you could actually read a book, do some writing, do some journaling, whatever it is. But the attention focuses, and if you're working with it, if you're really bringing your effort to it, what happens is that the memory and the thinking just fades into the background. It doesn't completely go away, but it's not interfering. So these two things together, depending on the strength, this letting go effort can be very, very powerful. And when you have an anxiety, attack, a depression attack, a negative thought attack, a negative memory attack, this can be very, very powerful stuff to deal with that. Now, you have to make it a habit, which means that in the same way that memories repeating themselves over and over again, they become strong and fixed. You have to do this repeatedly and learn from it. You're not just letting go, you're actually seeing what happens when you try to let go. You're learning how to release, what that feels like. You're experiencing moments of release, and you're seeing it. When you do that, you have insight, so you learn how to do that, and then it becomes a habit. So you have to want it. When we're dealing with long held entrenched states of mind and memories, it just takes work. No way around it. That's Buddhist practice. The second one, and this is a little more investigatory, exploratory, is that you focus on the causation and not the content in the present moment. And so when it comes up, you actually shift your focus into the reactive pattern. So you see that there's been this trigger, and that the trigger actually expresses itself in a particular way in the body. Tightness, warmth, the mind becomes confused or chaotic or clamps down, but there is always an urge. And it could be the urge to jump into the story, which is almost always the case, to hold on, to defend yourself, which is agitation, or identification, where I want to manage, control it, or I want to conceptualize it. So you use all of those. Normally, we just buy into that. So the new habit that we're developing, and we're investigating this, is watching that over and over again, and seeing that when we do that, it points our mind in the wrong way, and then refocus our mind into present moment experience. So once again, that's a lot of work, but that's core Buddhist practice in meditation and in daily life. All of these are, and they can be transformative. So I think that's where I'm going to stop and open this up for comments, questions, objections, whatever is happening.
Right. Yeah.
So,
hi everyone on Zoom. This is Robin and Angela. And in the hall, if you're on Zoom and you have a question, you can raise a hand. And for those of you in the Zoom or in the hall, Jen will come, or Ella will come and give you the microphone. And since we already have a question on Zoom, I'm just going to pick Nicholas. If you could just unmute yourself and go ahead, and then Jen will call someone in the hall.
Robin. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dennis. Thank you very much for the teaching.
Yeah, hi, Nicholas.
Hello, Dennis. My question is how to formulate that. It's very beautiful what you said, and very intriguing. And it's related to what is the next step. I mean, I heard you saying that one approach is to basically repeat either one of those methods of shifting the attention or looking for the somatic expression, and looking for the insights that come out from those, how to say, those shifting of derailing the patterns, of associative patterns, the repetition. And it's interesting that the Stoics had something similar. They called it cognitive impression. So basically stay at the gate of the perception and don't just go automatically with, let's say, there is smell of coffee in the room in the morning, doesn't mean that I get coffee just because, you know, it smells like coffee in that moment. So what I'm trying to ask you is how to connect those pointers with the two noble truths, you know, the wholesome view and the intention to become more awake. So basically, it seems to me that the whole Theravada challenge or promise, or the beauty of it, is as if a lot of tools are on the table, and the challenge is to make those things how to say, take shape at the same time, simultaneously. Otherwise, they stay in a one-dimensional thing, and there is no construction that basically creates, you know, the awakened state. So that's my question. And you already said a lot of great things about that. I'm just curious, you know, for more, you know, how that translates into more awakened state instead of going with the train of repetitive path, you know, unexamined repetitive pattern and staying asleep.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you. That was articulate, and I appreciate you're saying that you think it's intriguing, because that's how I view this. I mean, this is the most fascinating stuff because it has to do with how we identify ourselves and the role that memory plays in our decision making. It really is fascinating. So the issue of how do all of these different tools and approaches fit together is confusing, I think, for people for a long time. It takes time to get your feet on the ground and see what works for you and what doesn't. But that little quotation I used from U Tejani, I think, is quite helpful. And, you know, he said that we're driven by two causes, and one is pre-existing habits, mental formations, and then what we do in the present moment. And the goal in the present moment, from a Theravada Vipassana perspective, is to have a calm and clear mind, a balanced mind, to the degree that we can see into the experience that's unfolding, and then bring all of these tools, you know, right thought, right speech, all of these things, to what we see. So, but the starting point is having the clarity and calmness of mind, to the degree that we can have that, to actually see what the situation is in the moment. And I think people go by this, you know, it's like, well, gee, this is a difficult memory, or well, I'm supposed to apply this tool. No, the first step is to get the mind calmed down and in balance, so it can see as clearly as it can in the moment. And then that gives us the ability to make a good choice of how to use all these tools. So, you know, we can make practice like really confusing and complex, and all, but in the end, that's it. It's like, we're in this moment right now. How do I get my mind in balance to the degree that I can see? And then how do I make a wise choice that points my mind and my heart in the right direction? Yeah. And then if we can do that, the situation itself, as I mentioned in guiding in the minute, actually opens up, and you can see what the proper response is, that you couldn't see before. Because if your mind's agitated or aroused to the degree that it's out of balance, you can't see what is helpful. You'll make a bad choice. You know, that's what's called ignorance, right? So that would be my short form answer.
Thank you very, very much, Dennis. That makes a lot of sense, because what I realize is that, you know, for example, what you said, came from the perspective of truth. You know, we imagine that we know the truth, but we are asleep, or let's say most of the time I'm asleep, but you know, I have that claim that I want the truth. You know, everybody wants to see the truth. But the point is that as long as I'm asleep, whatever truth I can experience, it is bound to be partial. It is bound to be fragmented. It's bound to be delusional. So what you're saying is that first, come to a state of mind that is more clear and less delusional, and then whatever truth is coming is going to be over different. Do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the 3 trainings of the Eightfold Path, they're all directed at bringing the mind into balance and then providing tools to make wise choices. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So thank you.
This is Jen from the hall. Does anybody have a question in this room? Okay, I did see Philip had a hand up.
If you could speak up just a little.
Philip, would you like to go
hi,
ahead with your
Danny.
question?
Yeah. So Dennis, if I wrote down one of the last things you said was, if I got this correct, was focus on causation and not on the content of the present moment. Is that accurate?
Okay, it's a focus on the what I'm referring to as causation in the present moment. That is that the reactivity takes place and you're exploring the reactivity itself and not going into the content or narrative of the story that's associated with the reaction. So the illustration would be, you know, I'm sitting here minding myself, and for some reason, I remember something that triggers by an event that was unhappy in my life. And all of a sudden, you know, my body's lit up and my mind wants to go into this narrative about, oh my, I can't believe that happened. And when she said X, that was so rude. and so the strategy is don't go there. That's just going to make you suffer, period. Where you go is the reaction itself, which is dependent origination, the steps. So you can feel in your body that a reaction has occurred. You can discern whether it's arousal or agitation or identification. And then when you sit with that, just, you know, let all that energy subside, and then you can start to see what you need to do. If I go into the story about it, I'm just lost. And why? Because it's all about me. It's personalizing, it's identification, and that's where our primary suffering comes from. Does that help?
Well, that certainly helps. The conundrum for me is, it just feels like, I guess maybe this is where practice happens, is going into the body and feeling the reactions and the emotions. Feels like it's gonna, in my mind, gonna lead deeper into the story and all the things that happened.
Yeah.
That created the feelings, those strong feelings that are occurring in the moment.
Yeah, I understand that completely, and that is, I think, a common Western response that really, I'm serious. The Western response is, you know, I'm afraid of my emotions.
Yeah.
You know, I want to suppress them or control them or do something with them. That's what makes them so powerful. So if we can just open to them and just feel the sensation of resentment or anger or fear or shame, rather than all of the story and the I, me, mind about it, it just becomes an energetic thing in your body and starts to dissipate.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that this is easy, okay? and this is the reason Buddhist practice is not easy, but this is possible.
Okay.
And you talk to people who have been practicing for quite a while, they will tell you that over a period of years, their emotional life has changed significantly because they can do this, because they're not personalizing the energy in their body and the reactivity in their body all the time. So it's, as I said, you know, I tried to really be clear about it. This takes some work and some effort. You have to want this, and you have to want to make it a habit. Um, but if you do, then you practice that way, and change is possible. So,
Good, thank you.
so thank you.
Anybody in the hall have a question?
Okay.
Great. I think we're good
One
here.
more row.
Rolita, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. Hi, Dennis. Thank you very
Related.
much for this. Hi, this was a great talk. I have been practicing for probably a little over a year and a half, so I'm kind of new to this, but I have owned that I overthink a lot. And so part of meditation is helping me with that. And so when you talk about, you know, having these feelings and then shifting to the present moment experience, a lot of times for me, I have to really understand why I'm feeling that way. Does it help to delve into that before I try to shift in the present experience? Because my mind will wander back to, why am I having these emotions in the first place?
Yeah, of course. And, you know, this is a fascinating thing. And it relates actually to conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's, because there's a direct relationship between thought and emotion. And what will happen with people who have brain injuries or dementia or Alzheimer's is they lose the connection between the thought or the memory and the emotion, so that you're upset but you don't know why, or you're happy and you don't know why. But I think that there is an overemphasis from a Buddhist perspective. There's an overemphasis in the West of understanding why we're upset. And so I want to key off of what I said earlier, that the the question is that in this moment, what's shaping it are prior habits, and then what we do right now. And the first thing we have to do is we have to get our mind into sufficient balance that we can actually see what's going on, rather than seeing through the memory or the emotion. So what I find in my case is really helpful is to really, move to that balancing the mind, all the different ways we can do that, and sensory awareness, and getting grounded, and then opening back up, and then say, well, what's helpful now? Okay. So do I now feel that I need to look at the cause of this, or would it be helpful to do some more calming? Would it be helpful to do some metta? Would it just be helpful to go for a walk to get in balance, so I actually can explore emotionally? So
Okay.
my experience is that these kind of techniques that we were talking about this evening help you depersonalize the strength of negative states of mind. So you bring the temperature down, and then as a result of that, you can see things that you couldn't see when you were so aroused, and
Okay.
you have an ability to work with them that you didn't have before. So
Okay.
I think it's important to do that, but the sequencing for me is the key, the quality of your mind.
Okay. Thank you.
That
Yeah,
help?
I've had it. It's easier to like stifle and move forward. So I don't want to do that, but I don't want to overthink things. And so just meditations help me a lot, but I'm finding that in the process, I find myself thinking about things more. I have to process it, and so as I'm meditating, a lot of my distraction comes from, okay, I need to process that through in order to focus and breathe through it and move past it.
During meditation, I would really work, maybe you want to listen to the last part of this talk. I would really work on those techniques to not go into the processing in meditation.
Yeah.
because this is where you'll start to learn a new habit. And the Buddha, as I said at the start of the techniques, the Buddha really encouraged us to question our thoughts. And so what you might do, just exploratory, is when your mind comes up and like, gee, I've got to process this. Well, do I really need to do that?
Yeah.
Or do I really need to do it now?
Mhm.
Rather than just saying, oh, well, my mind's saying that, I mean, I must have to do it, or it must be the right thing.
Mhm.
So start to break the habit that you make the decision
Mhm.
of when you do the processing, rather than your mind telling you that you've got to do it now, and you follow this instruction that's basically a habit.
Right. Okay. It's becoming easier now, and I'm just taking notes after. So I'm bringing myself back a little easier, but I'm noticing that about myself. And that's the beauty of it, is that I am noticing what's happening.
Yeah.
But thank
Well,
you. Thank you.
yeah, and listen, you're not alone. This overthinking thing is not a big club, it's a huge club.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we're over time, so I just want to thank everyone and say that certainly my deepest wish, and my hope and my aspiration is that our cumulative effort and intention tonight, the merit of that, in some real way, helps everyone who's struggling in the world to struggle just a little bit less, and everyone who needs a little bit of kindness in their life gives themselves some kindness, and that the work that we're doing um, leads to harmony and satisfaction, not only in our own lives, but in our families and the people we know, and allowing that to spread out into the world. So thank you very much.